U.S. and Israel strike Iran? Is this prophecy? Sirens. That's how it started. Not with a press conference, not with a diplomatic cable, with sirens ripping through the night air over Tel Aviv. February 28, 2026. Israel confirms a strike. You will be shocked by 5 facts about this. Number 1. Why Israel struck first. Israel Defense Minister Katz declares a special and immediate state of emergency across the entire country. Israeli airspace closes to all civilian flights. Civil defense alerts expand nationwide to every major population center. The Iron Dome activated. For months, negotiations had been failing. Diplomatic channels between the United States and Iran had gone nowhere. American envoys, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, traveled to Oman and then to Geneva, Switzerland, in an attempt to reach some kind of breakthrough. President Trump publicly stated that he preferred a peaceful and diplomatic path. Every effort was made, but Iran was not cooperating. And behind the scenes, the intelligence picture was getting darker by the week. And here's what makes this so prophetically significant. And this is something that will become absolutely crucial when we reach Ezekiel chapter 38. Pay attention to who Iran's allies are during this crisis. Pay attention to which nations are coordinating with Tehran behind the scenes. Because when we lay those names next to what Ezekiel wrote 2,600 years ago, you are going to see something that will stop you cold. Iran was actively rebuilding uranium enrichment capacity. Missile production facilities were being expanded. Launch complexes were being hardened and reinforced. And buried within classified briefings, shared at the highest levels between Washington and Jerusalem, was something that changed the entire calculation. Intelligence indicating a possible imminent threat. Not a future one, not a hypothetical one, an imminent one. So after every failed negotiation, after every escalation, after every intelligence briefing warning of what Iran was preparing, Israel made the decision it had been building toward for months. Strike first. Or risk being struck in a way you cannot recover from. The operation was codenamed Roaring Lion, and the targets were not symbolic. They were strategic, precise, and devastating. IRGC command structures, the nerve centers of Iran's Revolutionary Guard, ballistic missile storage and launch complexes, the weapons designed to reach Israeli cities in 12 minutes, air defense systems, to blind Iran's ability to protect its own territory, nuclear-linked infrastructure in Tehran, Isfahan, Qom, Karaj, and Kermanshah, and leadership compounds. Reports indicated direct strikes aimed at the compound of Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei himself. Attempts on President Masoud Pezeshkian. Senior IRGC commanders targeted by name. This was not a limited strike. This was not a warning. This was Israel's strategic doctrine, made real in a single night. Preemption over absorption. Deterrence through decisive action. Israel framed this publicly and explicitly as existential defense, not aggression, survival. The elimination of threats that, if left unchecked, could end the Jewish state. But Israel did not act alone. And what happened next widened this conflict into something the world had not seen in over 2 decades. Number 2, Operation Epic Fury. The U.S. enters. Now, let me widen the lens, because what I'm about to describe changed the entire nature of this conflict in a matter of hours. The United States entered the fight, and the scale of American involvement was staggering. The USS Gerald R. Ford, the the largest aircraft carrier ever built, was already positioned in the Mediterranean Sea just off the coast of Israel, near the northern city of Haifa. The USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group was stationed in the Arabian Sea. American destroyers were positioned across the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf. Over 120 combat aircraft surged across the region in coordinated waves. Tanker aircraft in the air, enabling sustained sorties around the clock. AWACS airborne command and control platforms directing the entire theater of operations from 40,000 feet. This was not a symbolic show of support. This was not a diplomatic gesture wrapped in military hardware. This was the largest American regional military posture since the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Not symbolic, operationally decisive. Because when we read the list of nations Ezekiel names in the coalition against Israel, there is one nation conspicuously absent. And that absence is one of the most debated mysteries in all of Bible prophecy. The Pentagon designated the American operation as Operation Epic Fury. President Trump announced what he called major combat operations in a video posted to Truth Social. He framed it as necessary to destroy Iran's missile and nuclear capabilities and to prevent threats to the United States and its allies. And then he said something that sent shockwaves through every diplomatic channel on Earth. He urged the Iranian people directly to take over their government. He called this their chance for generations. Now, let me detail the capability that was brought to bear. Tomahawk cruise missiles launched from destroyers and submarines, capable of striking targets deep inside Iranian territory with precision. Bunker buster, massive ordnance penetrator bombs, the largest non-nuclear weapons in the American arsenal, designed specifically to reach deeply buried and hardened facilities. Electronic warfare suppression systems that blinded Iran's radar and communication networks. Ballistic missile interception platforms protecting Allied assets across the Gulf region. But here's what's critical to understand. There was no ground invasion posture, no troops massing on borders, no armored divisions rolling toward Iran. This was an air and missile dominance strategy. Overwhelm from above, destroy capability, degrade command and control, eliminate infrastructure, and do it all without a single American boot crossing into Iranian soil. Now, why does all of this matter for what we're about to study in Scripture? Because the nature of this operation, its coalition structure, its targets, its scale, and especially its consequences, set the stage for something that prophecy students have been watching for. Something written over 2,600 years ago. And the connection between what just happened militarily and what Ezekiel described prophetically is more direct than you might expect. But before we get to the Bible, you need to see what happened on the other side. Because Iran's response introduces a detail that connects directly to one of the most terrifying prophecies in Zechariah. And most people watching the news right now have no idea they're looking at it. Iran responds. Now, let me flip the perspective. Because while the world was watching Israel's strikes unfold, Iran was already launching its response, and it was rapid. Ballistic missiles fired toward Israel, multiple salvos, aimed at population centers, drone swarms deployed in waves designed to overwhelm defensive systems through sheer volume. And the threats didn't stop at Israel. Iran activated its entire proxy network. Hezbollah went on high alert along Israel's northern border, signaling readiness for a second front. Houthi forces in Yemen signaled operational readiness in the Red Sea, threatening international shipping lanes. Iranian-backed militias across Iraq and Syria received orders to prepare. And here's what's chilling about this, and it ties directly to what we'll discover in Ezekiel. This is not just Iran responding. This is a network, a web of allied forces spread across multiple nations, coordinating against Israel simultaneously. When we reach Ezekiel 38, you're going to see that the prophet described exactly this kind of multi-nation, coordinated assault. Not a single enemy, a coalition. Remember that word, coalition. And then came the direct strikes on American targets. Iran launched missiles at U.S. military bases across the Gulf. Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. Bases in Kuwait. Bahrain, home to the U.S. Navy's 5th Fleet headquarters. Al Dhafra Air Base in the United Arab Emirates. American assets in multiple countries targeted simultaneously. Tehran issued a statement declaring all U.S. and Israeli interests in the entire region legitimate targets. They vowed what they called a crushing response with advanced capabilities the world had not yet seen. And here's the detail that should sit with you. Ballistic missiles launched from Iran take approximately 12 minutes to reach Israel. 12 minutes. That's the window between a launch detection and impact. 12 minutes to grab your children. 12 minutes to reach a shelter. 12 minutes to pray. Israeli bomb shelters filled to capacity. Hospitals moved patients underground. Schools were shut down. Workplaces closed. Public gatherings banned. Reservists called up across the country. The entire nation locked down, bracing for the next wave. And here's something I need you to hold in your heart, not just your mind. Behind every one of these statistics, behind every shelter that filled, behind every siren that sounded, there are real families, real children, real fear. And it's not just in Israel. There are reports of a girls' elementary school struck in southern Iran. We will come back to this, because the human cost of what's happening demands more than analysis. It demands grief. And the retaliation was not slowing down. It was accelerating. But this was no longer just about Israel and Iran, because what happened next pulled the entire world into the crisis. Because the shockwaves from this conflict didn't stop at the borders of Israel or Iran. They reached every continent on Earth within hours. Oil markets spiked immediately. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow maritime choke point through which roughly 20% of the world's entire oil supply passes every single day, was suddenly under threat. If Iran disrupted traffic through that strait, even temporarily, the global economy would buckle. Energy prices surged overnight. Global shipping companies began rerouting vessels around the Cape of Good Hope, adding weeks to delivery schedules. Stock markets trembled as futures contracts priced in the possibility of sustained conflict. Russia condemned American involvement publicly and forcefully, calling it a violation of international law. And here's something that should grab your attention and hold it. Just days before the strikes began, Russia and Iran had conducted joint naval exercises. Arms support from Moscow to Tehran had been accelerating for months, and Western intelligence agencies had flagged growing concerns about Russian satellite intelligence being shared with Iranian military commanders. China was watching closely, publicly cautious, privately calculating. Gulf states that had been struck by Iranian retaliation missiles were caught in an impossible position. Allies of the United States, hosting American bases, now absorbing incoming fire meant for Washington. This was no longer a regional skirmish between two old enemies. This was geopolitical realignment happening in real time. Alliances being tested under fire, boundaries being redrawn, power structures shifting, the entire global order adjusting to the weight of a single night's decisions. And that's when something clicked for millions of believers around the world who were watching these events unfold. Because the alliances forming, the specific nations involved, the geography, the coalition structure, the rhetoric, it all started to echo something ancient, something written thousands of years ago by a Jewish prophet exiled in Babylon. If you know your Bible, you already know where this is going. But even if you think you know, what comes next may surprise you. Because what Ezekiel actually says is more specific, more detailed, and more relevant to this exact moment than most people realize. And there is one condition in the prophecy, one single detail, that tells us with startling clarity what this moment is and what it is not. Most prophecy teachers skip right over it. I will not. What Ezekiel actually says. Ezekiel was not a casual observer. He was a Jewish priest, a man trained in the law, taken captive to Babylon during one of the darkest periods in Israel's entire history. The year was approximately 597 BC. The Babylonian Empire had invaded Judah. The temple, the center of Jewish worship, the dwelling place of God's presence, was about to be destroyed. The people were scattered. The royal line appeared to be finished. The land promised to Abraham was occupied by a foreign power. And from every human perspective, the nation of Israel was done. Finished. Erased from the map of history. And yet, in the middle of that darkness, in exile, far from Jerusalem, God gave Ezekiel a series of visions, not just about the exile, not just about Babylon, about the far future, about the latter days, about events that would unfold thousands of years after Ezekiel's bones had turned to dust. And here's what's critical to understand about the structure of Ezekiel's book, because this is something most people miss, and it changes how you read chapters 38 and 39. Ezekiel 36 and 37 describe the restoration of Israel, the dry bones coming back to life, the nation being regathered from among the nations, the people returning to the land. That prophecy was fulfilled in 1948 when Israel became a nation again after nearly 2,000 years of exile. It is one of the most extraordinary fulfillments of biblical prophecy in human history. And then, immediately after the restoration prophecy, comes Ezekiel 38. The invasion that follows the regathering. The attack that comes after Israel has returned to the land. The timing is not accidental. The sequence is deliberate. First, Israel is restored. Then, Israel is attacked. We have already witnessed the first part. The question is whether we are now watching the stage being set for the second. Now let me read you the prophecy itself, and I want you to listen to every name, every detail, because each one matters. Ezekiel 38, 1-6. And the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Son of man, set thy face against Gog, the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and prophesy against him, and say, Thus saith the Lord God, Behold, I am against thee, O Gog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and I will turn thee back, and put hooks into thy jaws, and I will bring thee forth, and all thine army, horses and horsemen, all of them clothed with all sorts of armor, even a great company with bucklers and shields, all of them handling swords, Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya with them, all of them with shield and helmet, Gomer and all his bands, the house of Togarma of the north quarters, and all his bands, and many people with thee. Now let me walk you through this name by name, because these are not random ancient words. They are not decorative language. Every single one of them has been traced by biblical scholars, historians, and ancient geographers to a specific modern nation or region. And when you see the full list laid out alongside tonight's headlines, you are going to understand why millions of believers have their Bibles open right now. Let's start at the top. Gog of the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. This is the leader of the invasion. Most Bible scholars identify Magog as the region north of the Black Sea and the Caucasus Mountains, modern-day Russia. The ancient Jewish historian Josephus, writing in the 1st century AD, identified Magog with the Scythians, a people who inhabited the lands that are now southern Russia and Central Asia. The phrase chief prince is also significant. In the Hebrew text, the word translated as chief is Rosh. Some scholars translate this as Prince of Rosh, and Rosh is widely understood as an ancient reference to the peoples who eventually became the Russians. Whether you translate it as Chief Prince or Prince of Rosh, the geographic direction is unmistakable. Ezekiel later confirms this in verse 15, identifying the leader as coming from the far north. If you draw a line due north from Jerusalem on a map, passing through Turkey, through the Black Sea, through Ukraine, you arrive in Moscow. Russia is directly, geographically, due north of Israel, the far north. And here's something that should make you sit up and pay attention. Remember what I told you earlier about Russia condemning the American strikes? Remember the joint naval exercises with Iran just days before this operation? Remember the intelligence concerns about Russian satellite data being shared with Iranian military commanders? Hold all of that, because we're about to see where Russia sits in Ezekiel's coalition. And it's not on the sidelines. It's at the head of the table. Meshech and Tubal. These are ancient regions located in what is now modern Turkey. The Assyrian records from the 8th and 7th centuries BC reference Mushki and Tabal as kingdoms in the area of central and eastern Anatolia. Modern-day Turkey. And here's the detail that makes this even more striking. Turkey appears multiple times in this coalition under different ancient names. Meshech and Tubal are Turkey. And as we'll see in a moment, Gomer and Togarmah are also linked to Turkey. Ezekiel mentions Turkey more than any other nation in this coalition aside from the leader. That tells you something about Turkey's significance in this end times alliance. And now we come to the name that connects this prophecy directly, unmistakably, to tonight's events. Persia. Right there in the text. Named explicitly, not symbolically, not through a vague metaphor that requires interpretation, not through a code word or a typological reference, explicitly, by name. Persia. Persia is the ancient name for modern-day Iran. The nation was called Persia internationally until 1935, when it officially adopted the name Iran. But even today, the Iranian people refer to their heritage, their culture, their civilization as Persian. The identification is not debated. There is no scholarly controversy here. Persia is Iran, period. And Persia is listed as a direct, named member of this coalition that comes against Israel in the latter days. Let that land for a moment. Let the weight of it settle. The nation that Israel struck tonight. The nation that is launching ballistic missiles at Tel Aviv right now. The nation whose leadership compounds and nuclear infrastructure are burning as we speak. That nation, Iran, is named by name in a 2,600-year-old prophecy about an invasion of Israel in the last days. And here's what makes this even more stunning, and it connects directly to what I told you to remember about Russia earlier in this video. Look at who Persia is allied with in Ezekiel's coalition. Look at who leads it. Russia at the head, Iran at its side. The exact relationship we are watching play out in real time tonight. the exact alliance that has been deepening for a decade, the exact partnership that coordinated military operations in Syria. But the coalition doesn't end there. There are more names, and each one tightens the prophetic picture. Cush. In the Hebrew Bible, Cush refers to the lands south of Egypt. Most scholars identify this as the region encompassing modern-day Sudan and Ethiopia, North African nations with significant Muslim populations and historical tensions with the West. Both nations sit in the exact geographic and political space Ezekiel described. Put, identified as Libya, another North African nation. Libya has been in a state of instability and civil conflict for over a decade since the fall of Gaddafi in 2011. The connections are layered. They're not just political, they're operational. And here's what most people miss about Cush and Put being listed together in this coalition. And this is going to become significant when we discuss the scenarios of what could happen next. These are not global superpowers. These are regional players. But their inclusion tells us something crucial. This invasion is not a two-nation operation. It is a multi-front, multinational coalition drawn from specific geographic regions. Russia from the far north, Iran from the east, Turkey bridging Europe and Asia, North Africa from the south and west. Israel would be surrounded, attacked from every direction simultaneously. Gomer. The ancient historian Josephus identified the descendants of Gomer with the Galatians, who settled in what is now central Turkey. Other scholars have linked Gomer to areas of Eastern Europe. Either way, the geographic fingerprint points to the same corridor, the land bridge between Europe and Asia, the region dominated by Turkey and its immediate neighbors. The House of Togarma of the North Quarters. Togarma is identified in ancient records as a region in eastern Turkey or Armenia. The phrase of the North Quarters reinforces the northern geographic orientation of the entire coalition. Some scholars extend Togarma to include Turkic peoples of Central Asia, nations like Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, and Azerbaijan. And then Ezekiel adds one final, haunting phrase, "And many people with thee." The coalition is not limited to the names listed. There are additional nations, additional forces, additional allies who join this invasion. The list Ezekiel gives is the core, but the coalition is larger than what he explicitly names. So let me lay out the complete picture of what Ezekiel describes. A coalition led by Russia, coming from the far north. Iran, explicitly named at Russia's side. Turkey, mentioned through at least 4 ancient identifiers, Meshech, Tubal, Gomer, and Togarma, the most mentioned nation in the entire coalition. North African allies including Libya and Sudan. Central Asian Turkic nations potentially included, and additional unnamed allies rounding out the force. This is not a vague prophecy. This is a roster. A military order of battle written 26 centuries before the alliances it describes existed. Now, look at the geopolitical reality of this very moment. Russia shields Iran diplomatically at the United Nations. The relationship is deeper and more operationally integrated than at any point in modern history. Turkey's trajectory is away from the Western alliance and toward the exact coalition Ezekiel described. North African instability continues to create opportunities for alignment against Western interests. This coalition did not exist 50 years ago. It barely existed 20 years ago. But it exists right now, tonight, as missiles fly between Iran and Israel. And it is exactly the coalition Ezekiel described 26 centuries ago. But now I need to tell you something equally important, because this is where careful Bible study separates itself from sensationalism. And this is the detail I told you about at the beginning of this video. The one that most people miss. The one that changes everything. Ezekiel 38 does not mention the United States. Remember what I said earlier about America's conspicuous absence? Here it is. The largest military power on Earth, currently raining Tomahawk missiles on Iran. The nation with carrier strike groups positioned on both sides of the theater. The nation whose president just announced major combat operations against Iran is nowhere in Ezekiel's prophecy. Nowhere. Not named. Not hinted at. Not alluded to through any ancient identifier that scholars have been able to find. That silence is deafening, and it raises a question that has haunted prophecy students for decades. Where is America when this invasion happens? Why is the world's greatest military power absent from the most detailed military prophecy in the Old Testament? Is America weakened? Is it distracted? Is it unwilling? Has something happened to remove it from the equation? We don't know. But the absence is conspicuous, and it should make every American watching this video pay very close attention. Ezekiel 38 also does not specify February 2026. It does not say that this particular strike is the invasion described in the prophecy, and it does not give us a calendar date for when the coalition assembles. What we are observing is not fulfillment. What we are observing is pattern, stage setting, the players assembling on the board, the alliances forming exactly along the lines Ezekiel drew, the chess pieces moving into positions that look remarkably, undeniably, specifically like the positions Ezekiel described over 2.5 millennia ago. But here's what makes this even more significant, and this is something that will become absolutely crucial in the next few minutes. Ezekiel doesn't just describe who invades, he describes why they invade. And the motivation he gives reveals something about the timing that most people completely overlook. Ezekiel 38, 12-13. To take a spoil, and to take a prey. To turn thine hand upon the desolate places that are now inhabited, and upon the people that are gathered out of the nations, which have gotten cattle and goods, that dwell in the midst of the land, Sheba and Dedan, and the merchants of Tarshish, with all the young lions thereof, shall say unto thee, Art thou come to take a spoil? Hast thou gathered thy company to take a prey? To carry away silver and gold? To take away cattle and goods? To take a great spoil? The motivation is economic. To take a spoil? To take a prey? Silver and gold, cattle and goods. This coalition does not invade Israel for religious reasons, not for ideology, not for territorial revenge, for resources, for wealth, for economic plunder. And what does Israel have that is so valuable? First, massive natural gas fields in the Mediterranean, the Leviathan field, the Tamar field. Enough gas to make Israel energy independent and a major exporter. Second, technology. Israel is a global leader in cybersecurity, military tech, agricultural innovation, water desalination, and medical technology. Third, strategic position. Control of Israel means control of Middle Eastern trade routes, access to the Mediterranean, and influence over the entire region. And here's the detail that ties this directly to what's happening tonight. If this strike cripples Iran economically, if sanctions tighten, if Iran's infrastructure is degraded, Iran's motivation to join a coalition that promises economic spoil only increases. A weakened Iran is a desperate Iran, and desperate nations join coalitions that promise plunder. And notice who protests the invasion: Sheba and Dedan. Most scholars identify these as the Arabian Peninsula nations, modern-day Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, and the merchants of Tarshish, with all the young lions thereof. Tarshish is debated, but many scholars identify it with Western maritime trading powers. These nations don't join the invasion. They protest it. They ask questions, but they don't stop it. They stand on the sidelines. The Western-aligned nations and the Gulf states issue statements. They condemn. They question. But they do not intervene. Does that pattern sound familiar? Gulf states caught in the middle tonight, absorbing missiles, issuing statements, but unable to change the trajectory. Western nations monitoring closely, condemning, but not stopping the fundamental dynamic between Russia, Iran, and Israel. The pattern Ezekiel described is not just who attacks, it's who stands by and watches. And both patterns are visible right now. But Ezekiel also describes the outcome of this invasion. And this is where the prophecy becomes truly breathtaking. Because the coalition does not win, it is not Israel's military that defeats them. It is God Himself. Ezekiel 38:18-22. And it shall come to pass at the same time, when Gog shall come against the land of Israel, saith the Lord God, that my fury shall come up in my face. For in my jealousy and in the fire of my wrath have I spoken. Surely in that day there shall be a great shaking in the land of Israel, so that the fishes of the sea, and the fowls of the heaven, and the beasts of the field, and all creeping things that creep upon the earth, and all the men that are upon the face of the earth, shall shake at my presence, and the mountains shall be thrown down, and the steep places shall fall, and every wall shall fall to the ground. And I will call for a sword against him throughout all my mountains, saith the Lord God. Every man's sword shall be against his brother. And I will plead against him with pestilence and with blood. And I will rain upon him, and upon his bands, and upon the many people that are with him, an overflowing rain, and great hailstones, fire, and brimstone. God sends a massive earthquake, mountains thrown down, every wall falls. God turns the coalition armies against each other. Confusion causes them to fight among themselves, brother against brother. God sends pestilence and disease through the invading forces. And God rains fire and brimstone from heaven. Supernatural judgment. Divine intervention on a scale the world has never witnessed. The result? Ezekiel 39:2 tells us only 1/6 of the invading army survives. That is an 83% casualty rate. Not from Israeli air power, not from American Tomahawk missiles, from the direct hand of God. And God says explicitly why He does this. Ezekiel 38:23. Thus will I magnify myself and sanctify myself, and I will be known in the eyes of many nations, and they shall know that I am the Lord. The purpose of this divine intervention is revelation, so that the nations, all of them, will know that God is the Lord. This is not just a military event, it is a theological event. God will use this invasion and its supernatural defeat to reveal Himself to the entire watching world. Now, we have not seen this happen yet. Tonight's strikes are not this event. The divine intervention of Ezekiel 38 has not occurred. But the coalition that Ezekiel said would form before that intervention, it is forming. Right now, in real time, on our screens, in our headlines, in the very alliances that are being tested and strengthened by tonight's crisis. 4 biblical prophecies about Iran. 4 specific predictions written thousands of years ago by 2 different prophets, Jeremiah and Ezekiel, in two different books of the Bible, addressing two different dimensions of Iran's prophetic future. Prophecy number 1. The breaking of Elam's bow. Iran's prominence in biblical prophecy is not random. It's not a coincidence of geography. Persia was Israel's deliverer, its liberator, its protector. And then, in 1979, with the Islamic Revolution, everything reversed. The nation that once freed Israel became the nation most committed to destroying it. The deliverer became the enemy. And the prophets, writing 2,600 years before that reversal occurred, described both roles. They described the deliverance, and they described the judgment. Turn to Jeremiah chapter 49, verse 35. Because what this verse says, written roughly 2,600 years ago by a prophet who had never heard of ballistic missiles, drone warfare, or nuclear enrichment, reads like it was torn from this week's headlines. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, Behold, I will break the bow of Elam, the chief of their might. Now let me unpack this. Elam is an ancient region in what is now southwestern Iran, specifically the area around modern-day Khuzestan province. This is not a different country from Persia. It is a different region within what we now call Iran. And the fact that Jeremiah prophesies against Elam specifically, while Ezekiel prophesies about Persia more broadly, tells us that God has more than one prophetic word concerning this nation. Multiple prophecies, multiple dimensions, multiple timelines. The bow of Elam was its primary weapon. In the ancient world, Elamite archers were legendary, feared across the entire region for their skill, their range, and their devastating effectiveness in battle. The bow was not a secondary weapon for Elam. It was the chief of their might, the defining military capability that made Elam a power to be reckoned with. And God says He will break it. Now think about what the bow represents in modern terms. What is the chief of Iran's might today? What is the primary military capability that makes Iran a regional power, that allows it to project force, that makes its enemies calculate before acting? Its ballistic missile program, its drone capability, its air defense systems, its nuclear infrastructure. These are the modern equivalents of Elam's ancient bow, the weapons that define Iran's military identity and give it the ability to threaten nations thousands of miles away. And as of March 2026, those capabilities are being systematically destroyed. Operation Epic Fury has struck ballistic missile production facilities, storage sites, and mobile launchers. B-2 stealth bombers have dropped bunker-buster munitions on deeply buried underground sites. Iran's air defense network has been suppressed. Its navy has been functionally eliminated. Over 30 vessels sunk or disabled. Its ballistic missile launch capability has been reduced by an estimated 86%. Now, I need to be careful here. And this is where responsible teaching separates itself from sensationalism. What we are seeing may be the beginning of what Jeremiah described, but the prophecy describes something more comprehensive than a military campaign conducted by human armies. I will break the bow. The subject is God, not the United States, not Israel, God. The prophecy describes a divine action, a breaking so total, so decisive, so unmistakably from the hand of God, that it cannot be attributed to human strategy alone. And that means what we're watching right now may be stage setting rather than fulfillment. The military strikes are real. The degradation of Iran's capabilities is measurable. But the prophecy implies a breaking that is irrevocable. A destruction of Iran's military power that is so complete, so permanent, and so clearly supernatural in its scope that the entire world recognizes it as divine judgment, not just military defeat. What's left to happen? A decisive, unmistakable collapse. Not just degradation, but elimination of Iran's ability to project military force. A collapse so dramatic that it cannot be explained by airstrikes alone. A breaking that leads directly into the next three elements of Jeremiah's prophecy. And that brings us to the second prophecy, because Jeremiah doesn't just describe the breaking of the bow. Prophecy number 2, the scattering of Elam. Jeremiah 49:36. And upon Elam will I bring the 4 winds from the 4 quarters of heaven, and will scatter them toward all those winds, and there shall be no nation whither the outcasts of Elam shall not come. 4 winds, 4 quarters of heaven, scattered to every nation on earth. This is not a localized displacement. This is not a temporary refugee crisis. This is a global diaspora, a scattering so complete that the outcasts of Elam appear in every nation under heaven. Now here's what makes this prophecy so striking in light of modern history. Because the scattering of Iran's people has already begun. It began in 1979, when the Islamic Revolution overthrew the Shah and installed Ayatollah Khomeini's theocratic regime. Millions of Iranians fled the country. They fled to the United States, to Canada, to Europe, to Australia, to every continent on Earth. The Iranian diaspora today numbers in the millions, with significant communities in Los Angeles, London, Toronto, Sydney, Berlin, Dubai, and dozens of other cities worldwide. Iranian professionals, academics, artists, entrepreneurs, and families have been scattered across the globe for over 4 decades. And that scattering has accelerated in waves after the 1979 revolution, during the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, after the 2009 Green Movement protests, after the 2019 and 2022 protest crackdowns, and now again in 2026, as the regime faces its most existential crisis in history. The power vacuum left by Khamenei's death, the ongoing military strikes, the economic collapse, the internal chaos, all of these are creating conditions that could produce the largest wave of Iranian displacement yet. Jeremiah said the outcasts of Elam would appear in every nation. Today, the Iranian diaspora is one of the largest and most geographically dispersed in the world. The scattering is not hypothetical. It is documented, measurable, and ongoing. And there's one more dimension to this scattering that most prophecy teachers mention, but few develop. And it connects to something happening right now that should bring tears to your eyes rather than fear to your heart. But I'm going to save that for the next prophecy. Because what God does after the scattering is the detail that changes everything. Now, let me ground this in the present reality. Because the conditions that could produce a dramatic acceleration of Iranian displacement are not theoretical. They exist right now. Iran's economy was already in crisis before Operation Epic Fury began. Inflation was running at record levels. Unemployment was devastating the younger generation. The same generation that took to the streets in 2022 chanting, "Woman, life, freedom." And the rial had lost most of its value against the dollar. Basic goods were becoming unaffordable for millions. Now add to that existing crisis the impact of a major military campaign, infrastructure damaged or destroyed, oil exports disrupted, sanctions tightened, internal power struggles consuming whatever remains of the government's capacity to function, and a population that has been told for decades that the regime would protect them from exactly this kind of attack, now watching their military humiliated and their country bombarded by the world's most powerful military alliance. The pressure on ordinary Iranian citizens, the millions who had nothing to do with the regime's policies, who simply want to feed their families and live in peace, is immense and growing. And when that kind of pressure reaches a tipping point, people move. They flee. They scatter. They go wherever they can find safety, opportunity, and survival. Jeremiah described it as the four winds, pressure from every direction, driving the people of Elam to every corner of the earth. And the conditions creating those four winds are converging right now. Military pressure from above, economic collapse from within, political chaos from the leadership vacuum, and social desperation from a population that has been pushed beyond its breaking point. The prophecy suggests a scattering so wide that Elam's people would appear in nations across the earth. Prophecy number 3. God setting his throne in Elam. Now, this is the prophecy that carries the most weight, because it doesn't just describe military defeat or population displacement. It describes something far more personal, far more specific, and far more devastating for the ruling power. Jeremiah 49:38. And I will set my throne in Elam, and will destroy from thence the king and the princes, saith the Lord. Two actions in one verse. First, God sets his throne in Elam. Second, God destroys the king and the princes. And both actions are attributed directly to God, not to a foreign military, not to a coalition of nations, to God himself. Now let me take these one at a time, because each one has a modern dimension that is impossible to ignore. I will destroy from thence the king and the princes. The king, the supreme authority, the ruler who sits at the top of the political, military, and religious hierarchy. In modern Iran, that was Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader since 1989, the man whose word was final on every matter of state, the man who held more power than any elected official, military commander, or religious authority in the country. And as of February 28, 2026, Khamenei is dead. Over 40 senior commanders, IRGC leaders, government officials, the princes, have also been killed. Jeremiah wrote those words roughly 2,600 years ago, and the king and the princes of Elam have been destroyed in the opening days of a military campaign that the regime never believed would come at this scale. Now I need to be honest about the limits of this parallel. The verse says, I will destroy. God as the agent, not a human military. And the destruction described may imply something more comprehensive than what has occurred so far. A total removal of the ruling class, not just the top layer. A new hardline successor could emerge. The Revolutionary Guard could reconstitute under different leadership. The regime could survive in some diminished form. For the prophecy to be fully fulfilled, the destruction of the king and the princes would need to be permanent and irreversible, not a temporary decapitation that the system recovers from. But here's the second half of the verse, and this is the part that should shift your attention from fear to hope. I will set my throne in Elam, God's throne, in Elam, in Iran. Now, what does that mean? Some interpreters read this as a reference to divine judgment, God establishing his authority over the land by executing judgment on its rulers. And that is a valid reading. But many scholars and many Iranian Christians see something more in this phrase. They see a reference to spiritual transformation, to God establishing his presence, his throne, not through military force, but through the advance of the gospel in the very land where the regime tried to stamp it out. And here's what makes that interpretation so powerful. Iran today has one of the fastest-growing Christian communities in the world. And I don't mean that as a vague, feel-good statistic. I mean it as a documented, researched, confirmed reality that is stunning in its scope. Despite decades of persecution, despite the execution of pastors, the imprisonment of converts, the closure of churches, the banning of Bibles in Farsi, the surveillance of house churches, and the threat of death for apostasy from Islam, the underground church in Iran has exploded. Estimates vary, but credible reports suggest that hundreds of thousands and possibly over 1 million Iranians have come to faith in Jesus Christ in recent years. Some estimates from organizations tracking persecuted Christians place the number even higher. And the mechanism of conversion is extraordinary. Iranian believers consistently report that they came to faith not through traditional evangelism, but through dreams and visions. Encounters with Jesus that they did not seek and cannot explain. A figure in white appearing in their sleep and saying, "Follow me." This phenomenon has been reported so widely and so consistently across the Iranian diaspora and inside Iran itself that it has become one of the defining characteristics of the Iranian church. A church born not from human missionary effort, but from direct, supernatural, divine encounter. I will set my throne in Elam. Could this be what Jeremiah was describing? Not a political throne, not a military occupation, a spiritual throne, the presence of God, through the Holy Spirit, through the gospel, through the miraculous conversion of souls, establishing itself in the very land where the rulers tried to keep him out. The king and the princes are being destroyed, and the throne of God is being established, not through force, but through faith, not through bombs, but through dreams, not through regime change imposed from Washington, but through heart change initiated from heaven. Sometimes judgment and revival unfold at the same time. And what we may be witnessing in Iran is exactly that. The breaking of a regime that persecuted God's people, and the simultaneous advance of God's kingdom among the very people that regime oppressed. Now, before I move to the fourth prophecy, I need to show you how Jeremiah ends this oracle, because the final verse of Jeremiah's prophecy against Elam is not a curse, it's a promise. Jeremiah 49:39. But it shall come to pass in the latter days that I will bring again the captivity of Elam, saith the Lord. Restoration in the latter days, after the bow is broken, after the scattering, after the king and the princes are destroyed, after the throne of God is established, God promises to restore Elam. That verse should bring tears to your eyes, because the God of the Bible is not a God who destroys without purpose. He is not a God who judges without mercy. He is a God who breaks in order to rebuild, who scatters in order to gather, who removes rulers in order to establish his own reign, and who promises, in his own words, in his own text, in his own covenant language, that the story of Elam does not end in judgment. It ends in restoration, and the timing is explicit. In the latter days, the end of the age, the final period of human history, the same time frame in which Ezekiel 38 unfolds, the same time frame in which the birth pains of Matthew 24 intensify, the same time frame that many believers look at the current world and believe we are living in right now. The breaking of the bow, the scattering of the people, the destruction of the rulers, and then restoration. That is the arc of Jeremiah's prophecy against Elam. That is Jeremiah's prophecy. 3 dimensions of Iran's future covering military power, population displacement, and leadership upheaval, all ending in a promise of restoration. But Jeremiah is not the only prophet who addresses Iran's role in the last days, because Ezekiel adds a fourth dimension, one that shifts the focus from Iran's internal crisis to Iran's external alliances. And what Ezekiel describes is the prophecy that connects Iran not just to its own future, but to the final conflict of human history. Verse 5. Because in the middle of the most detailed geopolitical prophecy in the entire Old Testament, a prophecy that describes a specific coalition of nations invading Israel in the latter days, Ezekiel names a nation that you now know very well: Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya with them, all of them with shield and helmet. Persia, listed among the coalition nations, named explicitly, as part of an alliance that marches against a regathered Israel in the end of the age. Now this is the prophecy that shifts the entire conversation from Iran's internal crisis to Iran's external role. Because Jeremiah addresses what happens to Iran, Ezekiel addresses what Iran does. And what Ezekiel says Iran does is join a coalition, a specific, identifiable, latter-days alliance led by a power from the far north, and march against the nation of Israel. Ezekiel 38, 1-6. And the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Son of man, set thy face against Gog, the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and prophesy against him, and say, Thus saith the Lord God, Behold, I am against thee, O Gog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and I will turn thee back, and put hooks into thy jaws, and I will bring thee forth, and all thine army, horses and horsemen, all of them clothed with all sorts of armor, even a great company with bucklers and shields, all of them handling swords, Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya with them, all of them with shield and helmet, Gomer and all his bands, the house of Togarma of the north quarters, and all his bands, and many people with thee. The coalition is led by Gog, from the land of Magog, widely associated with Russia, or a northern Eurasian power. It includes Meshech and Tubal, ancient Anatolian regions in modern Turkey, Persia, Iran, Kush, Sudan, and the Horn of Africa, Put, Libya, and North Africa. Gomer and Togarma also linked to Turkey and surrounding regions. Mapped onto the modern world, this is an alliance of Russia, Iran, Turkey, and North African nations, all marching against Israel. And every one of those alliance relationships exists in the real world right now. Russia and Iran have a deepening military partnership. Turkey has been drifting from NATO toward closer ties with Russia. Iran funds proxy forces on every Israeli border. The framework of the coalition Ezekiel described is already operational. The prophecy doesn't describe a single enemy. It describes an alliance, and the architecture of that alliance is being built in plain sight. Now, let me show you why the current geopolitical landscape has prophecy watchers paying such intense attention. Because the alliance patterns between the Ezekiel 38 nations are not hypothetical. They are documented, deepening, and accelerating. Russia and Iran have conducted joint military operations in Syria. Russia has sold Iran advanced weapons systems, including air defense technology and fighter aircraft components. Russia provides diplomatic cover for Iran at the United Nations Security Council. And in the wake of Operation Epic Fury, Russia's calculations about Iran's survival and future alignment become even more consequential. Because a weakened Iran becomes a more dependent ally, not a less dependent one. Nations in crisis lean into their strongest partnerships, and Iran's strongest partner is Moscow. Turkey, while still a NATO member, has been on a trajectory of divergence from Western alliance structures for over a decade. It purchased the Russian S-400 missile defense system in defiance of NATO. It has strengthened economic and energy ties with Russia. It has intervened in Syria, Libya, and the Caucasus, often at odds with Western interests. And its relationship with Israel has deteriorated significantly under President Erdogan, who has been one of the most vocal critics of Israeli policy in the Muslim world. These are not future possibilities. These are current realities. The coalition Ezekiel described, Russia, Iran, Turkey, and their aligned partners, exists in embryonic form right now. The alliances are built. The hostility toward Israel is shared. The only question is whether these relationships will mature into the full military coalition Ezekiel described. And I want to be clear, these are possible precursors, not confirmation of the prophecy. The coalition has not formed in its full military configuration. The invasion has not occurred. The supernatural intervention described in Ezekiel 38 and 39 has not taken place. We are watching alignment, not fulfillment. But the alignment is closer today than it has been at any previous point in history. Now, let me show you the mechanism by which this coalition is drawn into conflict. Because Ezekiel doesn't say the nations choose to invade Israel on their own initiative alone. He says God draws them out. Ezekiel 38:4. And I will turn thee back, and put hooks into thy jaws, and I will bring thee forth, and all thine army, horses and horsemen, all of them clothed with all sorts of armor, even a great company with bucklers and shields, all of them handling swords. Hooks in the jaws. God places an irresistible pull on these nations, using their own hostility, their own ambitions, their own alliances as the mechanism, but controlling the timing and the trajectory. The coalition doesn't stumble into the invasion. They are drawn, sovereignly, purposefully, by a God who uses human choices to accomplish divine purposes. And here's the question that connects this directly to the current conflict. Could the military pressure on Iran right now be part of what creates the hooks? If Iran survives this war, weakened, humiliated, radicalized, could the desire for revenge, the need for powerful allies, and the desperation of a fractured regime drive it deeper into exactly the kind of coalition Ezekiel described? Could the very war that was meant to neutralize Iran be the hook that ultimately pulls it toward the prophetic confrontation? The prophecy suggests that even powerful nations can be drawn into events they cannot control. And the dynamic of escalation, alliance deepening, and strategic desperation that follows military defeat is exactly the kind of mechanism the hooks metaphor describes. Now step back and ask the question that sits underneath this entire prophecy. Why Israel? Of all the nations on earth, why is this the one that draws a coalition from Russia, Iran, Turkey, and North Africa to march against it? The answer has never been political. It has never been strategic. It is spiritual. Jerusalem is the city where God chose to place His name. Israel is the nation through whom God chose to reveal Himself to the world. The Jewish people are the people through whom the Messiah came. And the conflict over Israel, the hostility directed at it, the alliances formed against it, the obsessive international attention focused on it, is ultimately a spiritual conflict over God's covenant promises and God's redemptive plan. The Antichrist targets Israel because the Messiah comes from Israel. The coalition marches against Israel because God's purposes flow through Israel. And the reason Iran, Russia, Turkey, and their allies are drawn into this confrontation is not geopolitics. It's theology. It's the cosmic battle between the kingdom of God and the kingdom of darkness, played out on a physical map with real nations, real armies, and real consequences.
Many seem to be confused because they do not understand the book of Revelation. However, what if there was an animation showing the entire book? Well, we created that. And to watch that, click here.